The mother-in-law only came because she heard the champagne was imported from France, my son-in-law said into the microphone, while the ballroom burst into laughter around him. I kept smiling. I even lifted my glass slightly, as if I were part of the joke. But something inside me went very still. I'm Evelyn Carter. I'm 68 years old, and until that night, I truly believed humiliation only happened quietly behind closed doors. I never imagined it could happen beneath crystal chandeliers, while a jazz quartet played softly near an ice sculpture shaped like a company logo. Daniel Brooks stood at the center of the stage in a tailored black tuxedo, one hand wrapped around the microphone, the other resting confidently in his pocket. The large screen behind him displayed photos from his promotion celebration. Senior Vice President, Brooks Capital Group. Chicago's downtown skyline glittered through the towering windows of the Grand Monarch Hotel, and every table in the ballroom was filled with polished people wearing expensive watches and carefully practiced smiles. My daughter Melissa sat beside the stage in a silver dress that probably cost more than my first car back in 1979. She laughed too. Not loudly, not cruelly, but enough. Enough for me to notice. Enough for my stomach to tighten beneath my navy silk dress. I looked down at my untouched champagne. Tiny bubbles floated quietly to the surface. Around me, people continued chuckling while Daniel grinned like he'd delivered the cleverest line of the night. Come on, he added smoothly, waving his hand toward me. You all know Evelyn loves free luxury. More laughter. Softer this time. The kind people use when they're unsure how far they're allowed to go. I adjusted the pearl bracelet on my wrist and smiled again. My late husband Thomas bought me that bracelet on our 40th anniversary during a weekend trip to Charleston. He used to tell me elegance was how a person behaved when others forgot their manners. I repeated those words silently inside my head while Daniel continued his speech about leadership, hard work, and loyalty. Loyalty. Funny word. I had spent nearly 12 years helping that man build the life he was now celebrating. When Melissa and Daniel couldn't afford their first down payment, I emptied half my retirement savings without hesitation. When Daniel lost his job during the recession, I quietly paid their mortgage for 8 months and never mentioned it again. I even sold Thomas's vintage fishing boat because Melissa told me Daniel was embarrassed driving an old Honda to client meetings. You saved us, Daniel had whispered to me years ago while standing in my kitchen holding a coffee mug with shaking hands. I'll never forget this. But people forget quickly once they start sitting near power. A server approached and asked politely whether I wanted another drink. No thank you, I answered softly. My voice sounded calm. That surprised me. Across the ballroom, Daniel raised his champagne glass while executives applauded him. He looked confident, untouchable, like a man completely certain the people around him would never stop admiring him. Then his eyes met mine for half a second. Just half a second. Long enough for him to realize I was no longer laughing with everyone else. Long enough for me to understand something far more painful than the joke itself. Daniel hadn't humiliated me accidentally. He had rehearsed that line before he ever stepped onto the stage. I stayed at the table for another 20 minutes after Daniel finished his speech. Long enough to avoid making a scene. Long enough to let everyone believe I was perfectly fine. The ballroom grew louder as the night continued. Forks clinked against china plates. Waiters carried silver trays filled with miniature crab cakes and champagne flutes. Somewhere near the stage, a group of executives laughed too hard at something that probably was not very funny. I sat quietly and folded my napkin across my lap, while Melissa spoke with 2 women wearing glittering cocktail dresses. She barely looked at me anymore. That realization settled over me slowly, like winter frost creeping across a window pane. There was a time when my daughter searched for me in every crowded room. When she was 7 years old, she used to slip her small hand into mine at the grocery store because she thought strangers looked dangerous. Now she moved through the ballroom beside Daniel like she belonged to another world entirely. Evelyn, are you enjoying yourself? One of Daniel's co-workers asked politely as he passed our table. His name was Richard, I think. Tall man. Gray hair. Expensive cufflinks. It is beautiful, I answered with a smile that felt practiced from years of protecting other people's comfort. He nodded and walked away quickly, relieved he had done the socially correct thing by speaking to the older woman sitting alone near the back corner. Alone. Funny how loneliness feels heavier in crowded places. I looked around the ballroom carefully then. Really looked. Everything shimmered. Gold tablecloths. crystal centerpieces, giant floral arrangements overflowing with white orchids and roses. But underneath all that beauty sat something cold and performative. Conversations that sounded rehearsed. Smiles timed perfectly for networking opportunities. Compliments delivered like business transactions. Daniel fit perfectly into that world now. I remembered the first time Melissa brought him home nearly 15 years ago. He wore a wrinkled blue shirt and apologized 3 separate times for tracking snow into my kitchen. Back then, he spoke softly, carefully. He listened more than he talked. After dinner, I found him washing dishes without being asked. "You raised an incredible daughter," he told me while drying a plate with one of my old dish towels. I liked him immediately because he seemed humble. Thomas liked him too. My husband believed kindness mattered more than money. Sometimes I wonder what Thomas would say if he had lived long enough to see this version of Daniel. The version who stood beneath chandeliers making jokes about the woman who once helped keep his lights on. I reached into my purse and touched the small velvet box holding Daniel's promotion gift. A vintage silver pen engraved with his initials. I bought it 2 weeks earlier after spending nearly an hour speaking with a jeweler on Michigan Avenue. I wanted the gift to feel meaningful, personal. Suddenly, it felt foolish. A young server approached my table quietly. "Ma'am, would you like dessert?" she asked kindly. "Chocolate souffle, lemon tart, cheesecake." I almost laughed at the normalcy of the question. "Just coffee, please." She returned a few minutes later with a porcelain cup and a gentle smile that felt more sincere than anything else I had experienced that evening. I wrapped both hands around the warmth of the cup and watched Melissa across the room. Daniel leaned down to whisper something in her ear. She smiled immediately. Whatever he said erased the faint tension I had noticed after the speech. Then Melissa glanced toward me. Only briefly. Her smile faded for half a second before she looked away again. That was when I understood the most painful part of the evening. My daughter had not defended me because somewhere along the way, she had started seeing me through Daniel's eyes. Around 9:30, the ballroom slowly divided itself into smaller circles. Executives gathered near the whiskey bar, discussing investments and market forecasts while their wives compared vacation homes and private schools. I remained at my table beside my untouched dessert plate, listening more than speaking. People reveal themselves when they think an older woman is no longer important enough to notice things. That was something age had taught me very well. Melissa eventually walked over carrying 2 champagne glasses. "Mom, are you okay?" she asked carefully, placing one glass near me. The question sounded rehearsed, almost obligatory. I studied her face for a moment. She looked beautiful that night. Perfect makeup. Diamond earrings Daniel bought her last Christmas. But there was exhaustion beneath her eyes I had not noticed before. "I am fine," I answered. "You should be celebrating." She nodded too quickly. "Daniel was only joking earlier. You know how corporate parties are." Corporate parties. As if humiliation became elegant once rich people did it beneath chandeliers. I gave a small smile and adjusted the sleeve of my dress. "Of course." Melissa looked relieved by my calmness. That hurt more than the joke itself. My daughter had learned to feel comfortable around my silence instead of questioning what caused it. Before she could say anything else, Daniel appeared. Beside her with his arm resting lightly around her waist. "There you two are," he said smoothly. I was wondering if Evelyn had escaped already. Escaped? Even his harmless words carried something sharp underneath. "Your mother was just telling me she is enjoying herself," Melissa said quickly. Daniel smiled down at me, confident and polished. "Good. I would hate for anyone to think we do not know how to host properly." There it was again. That tone. Casual superiority wrapped in charm. I noticed then that Daniel only became openly dismissive around other people. Alone, he still behaved carefully, respectfully even. But in public, especially around wealthy colleagues, I became part of some performance he enjoyed controlling. A symbol of old-fashioned dependence he could quietly mock to prove how far he had risen above ordinary life. "Daniel," a voice called from across the ballroom. A tall blonde woman waved him over from near the stage. "The regional director wants another photo." Daniel gave Melissa a quick kiss on the cheek and flashed me another practice smile before walking away. Melissa watched him go with the nervous attention of someone constantly trying not to disappoint another person. "He has been under a lot of pressure lately," she said softly once he was gone. I looked at her carefully then. "Pressure changes people," I answered, "but it usually reveals who they already were." Melissa lowered her eyes immediately. The orchestra near the dance floor began playing an old Frank Sinatra song Thomas used to love. For one painful second, I imagined my husband sitting beside me. He would have squeezed my hand beneath the tablecloth and whispered something dry enough to make me laugh. Thomas never cared about status. He respected janitors the same way he respected lawyers. "Mom," Melissa said quietly, almost whispering now, "please do not make tonight difficult." I stared at her. Not angry, just tired in a way I could not fully explain. Difficult. Such a strange word. I had spent my entire life making things easier for everyone around me. Easier financially. Easier emotionally. Easier socially. I swallowed my disappointment slowly and nodded once. "I would never embarrass you," I said. Melissa visibly relaxed after hearing those words. But she misunderstood me completely. Because for the first time all evening, I was no longer worried about embarrassing her. I was beginning to wonder why I had spent so many years protecting people who no longer protected me. The party finally began thinning out a little after 10 o'clock. Older guests collected coats from the valet desk, while younger employees crowded near the rooftop terrace overlooking the Chicago River. I remained seated long after most people had moved on to dancing and cocktails. The silver gift box still rested inside my purse unopened and forgotten. I traced my fingers along the edge of the velvet lining while memories I had spent years carefully storing away began surfacing one by one. The first winter after Melissa married Daniel had been brutal. Snowstorms buried half the city, and Daniel's consulting firm collapsed 3 days before Christmas. I still remember the look on his face when they showed up at my front door carrying overnight bags because they could not afford heating for their apartment. Melissa tried to act brave, but her cheeks were red from crying in the car. Daniel barely spoke at all. Thomas welcomed them inside immediately. He carried their suitcases upstairs himself, even though his arthritis was already bothering him badly that year. For nearly 4 months, they lived in our guest room. I cooked dinner every night while Daniel searched for work. Some evenings I would hear him pacing the hallway at 2 in the morning because he was too anxious to sleep. One night, I found him sitting alone at the kitchen table staring at unpaid bills spread across the wood surface. "I feel like I failed your daughter," he admitted quietly. The refrigerator hummed softly behind us while snow tapped against the windows. I poured him fresh coffee and sat down across from him. "You are struggling," I told him. "That is not the same thing as failing." He looked so grateful then, so humbled by kindness. When Thomas passed away 6 years later, Daniel stood beside me at the cemetery, holding a black umbrella while icy rain soaked through his coat sleeves. "You will never be alone," he promised me after the funeral. Melissa cried against his shoulder while he rubbed her back gently. At the time, I believed every word he said. I think that is what hurts most when people change. Not the cruelty itself. The confusion of remembering they were once sincere. Or maybe they only appeared sincere when they still needed something from you. A waiter cleared empty glasses from nearby tables while I sat quietly with those memories pressing against my chest. Across the ballroom, Daniel laughed loudly beside a group of executives gathered around the rooftop doors. One of the men slapped him on the shoulder, while another handed him a cigar they probably planned to smoke outside despite hotel rules. Daniel looked comfortable there. Confident. He belonged to that world now completely. Suddenly a young woman approached my table holding a tablet against her chest. "Mrs. Carter?" she asked carefully. She looked no older than 28. Dark blonde hair pulled into a low ponytail. Simple black dress. Company event staff badge hanging from her neck. "Yes. I just wanted to say I loved your bracelet," she said warmly. "It is beautiful." I glanced down at the pearls and smiled politely. "Thank you." She hesitated slightly before lowering her voice. And for what it is worth, I did not think the speech earlier was funny. For the first time all evening, someone said the truth out loud without dressing it up in excuses. I studied her face carefully. Honest eyes. Nervous posture. The kind of discomfort decent people carry when they witness cruelty pretending to be humor. "That is kind of you," I answered softly. She looked toward Daniel across the ballroom before speaking again. "Mr. Brooks can be different around senior leadership." Different. Such a small word for such an ugly transformation. Before I could respond, someone near the stage called her name. "Claire, we need the updated guest photos." She gave me an apologetic smile and hurried away. But as I watched her disappear into the crowd, I realized something important. Not everyone in that ballroom had laughed because they found the joke amusing. Some laughed because they were. Afraid not to. By 11 o'clock, the ballroom lights dimmed slightly as the hotel staff prepared for the final round of speeches and photographs. Most guests had moved toward the rooftop terrace where the skyline reflected against the dark water below. I remained inside near the quieter side of the room, finally slipping off my heels beneath the table for a moment while rubbing the ache from my ankle. Age teaches you how to carry discomfort gracefully. Claire returned carrying a stack of printed seating charts pressed against her chest. She looked exhausted now, the way young people do when they are trying too hard to appear composed in professional environments. Long night? I asked gently as she paused beside my table. She gave a small laugh. These corporate events always look glamorous until you are the one fixing everybody's disasters. I smiled faintly at that. That sounds true about many things in life. She glanced around carefully before lowering herself into the empty chair beside me for just a second. I hope you do not mind me saying this, she said quietly, but I was surprised by what happened earlier. I stirred the melting ice in my water glass slowly. You were not the only one. Claire hesitated again. I could see her debating whether to continue. Mr. Brooks talks differently at the office than he does in public interviews. There was something careful in the way she phrased it. Not gossip, not cruelty, just honesty trying to remain professional. Differently how? I asked softly. She looked toward the terrace doors where Daniel stood laughing beside several executives. Sometimes he jokes about people in ways that make everyone uncomfortable. I said nothing. Claire twisted the edge of a paper seating chart nervously between her fingers. A few weeks ago, one of the directors asked whether your daughter came from money because of the neighborhood where she grew up. My chest tightened slightly. And Daniel said? Claire looked embarrassed now. He laughed and said your family was comfortable enough to rescue struggling sons-in-law. I stared down at the white tablecloth while the orchestra quietly transitioned into another song. Strange. How humiliation can continue unfolding long after the original wound. Layer after layer. Conversation after conversation you never even knew existed. He also jokes sometimes about older relatives becoming expensive, Claire admitted carefully. Most people laugh because he is senior management. Expensive. The word settled coldly inside me. I thought about the years after Thomas died. The endless paperwork. The silent dinners alone in a house, suddenly too quiet. Melissa used to call every evening back then. Sometimes she cried because she worried about me living alone. Daniel would get on the phone afterward and insist they were only 20 minutes away if I ever needed anything. Somewhere along the line, concern had turned into calculation. You should not feel obligated to tell me these things, I said gently. Claire shook her head immediately. No, I think someone should. Her honesty startled me more than the information itself. Young people rarely risk professional discomfort to defend someone older and invisible. Before I could respond, voices near the terrace suddenly grew louder. Daniel had gathered another crowd around him. Even from across the ballroom, his confidence filled the room like expensive cologne. I keep telling Melissa, he announced jokingly. We need to simplify certain family responsibilities before retirement becomes a full-time group project. Several people laughed automatically. My fingers stopped moving against the water glass. Claire looked horrified beside me because, unlike the others, she understood exactly who he meant. I watched Daniel smiling beneath the rooftop lights while executives nodded approvingly around him. He was not even trying to hide it anymore. That was the moment something inside me finally changed. Not shattered, not collapsed. Changed. Quietly. Completely. Like a door closing softly in the middle of the night. The hotel ballroom finally emptied close to midnight. Staff members folded linens and cleared champagne glasses while city lights shimmered beyond the tall windows overlooking downtown Chicago. I stood near the coat check slowly fastening the buttons of my wool coat when Melissa approached me with tense shoulders and tired eyes. Mom, are you ready? She asked quietly. Daniel was outside near the valet entrance speaking into his phone with the sharp, impatient tone businessmen use when they believe money gives them authority over time itself. I drove myself, I answered gently. Melissa hesitated. You could still follow us home for coffee. Home. Funny how children continue using that word long after a place stops feeling welcoming. Not tonight, I said. She looked relieved again. That small flicker of relief did not escape me anymore. Outside, cold wind rushed through the street as valets jogged back and forth beneath glowing hotel lights. Daniel finally ended his phone call, and walked toward us while adjusting his cufflinks. "There she is," he said smoothly. I was starting to think Evelyn disappeared without saying goodbye. I noticed Melissa glance nervously between us. She had spent the entire evening managing invisible tension like someone trying to keep a fragile glass from cracking. "The party was beautiful," I told him calmly. "You should be proud." Daniel smiled automatically. "Well, success takes planning." The way he said it sounded deliberate somehow, layered. Then he added, "Speaking of planning, Melissa and I actually wanted to talk to you soon about a few future ideas." Melissa immediately looked down at the pavement. My chest tightened quietly. "Future ideas?" I asked. Daniel slipped both hands into his coat pockets while snow drifted lightly through the yellow glow of the street lamps. "Nothing urgent," he said casually. "Just practical things. Simplifying responsibilities. Making sure everybody is comfortable long-term." Comfortable. Another soft word hiding something sharp underneath. "Daniel," Melissa whispered carefully, but he ignored her. "You have that beautiful house sitting half empty now," he continued. "The market in Lake Forest is incredible right now. Honestly, you could sell, move into one of those luxury retirement communities downtown, and free yourself from all the maintenance stress." There it was. Finally spoken clearly enough to hear. Not concern. Strategy. I looked at Melissa then. Really looked at her. She avoided my eyes completely. "You discussed this already?" I asked softly. Silence answered first. Then Melissa nodded once. "Small. Guilty." Daniel stepped forward smoothly before she could speak. "We are only thinking ahead. At some point it becomes smarter financially to consolidate assets instead of pouring money into unnecessary properties." Assets. Properties. The language of family had disappeared from his vocabulary entirely. Suddenly Claire's words returned to me with uncomfortable clarity. Expensive relatives. Retirement liabilities. Simplifying responsibilities. None of this started tonight. Tonight was simply the first time Daniel stopped disguising his intentions as kindness. "I see," I answered quietly. Daniel smiled again, clearly mistaking my calmness for agreement. "We can talk details later." No pressure. No pressure. Except there it was standing directly in front of me, wearing an expensive wool coat and a confident smile. A valet pulled Daniel's black Mercedes sedan toward the curb, while Melissa wrapped her coat tighter around herself against the cold. "Mom," she said softly before getting into the car, "do not overthink tonight." I almost smiled at that. Overthinking. As if years of sacrifice turning slowly into disrespect was merely confusion on my part. As if humiliation only existed when acknowledged aloud. I watched their car disappear into traffic beneath the glowing city lights while snowflakes gathered quietly across the shoulders of my coat. Then I reached into my purse and touched the velvet gift box one final time before dropping it carefully into the nearest trash bin. The drive back to Lake Forest felt longer than usual that night. Snow drifted steadily across the highway while the city skyline disappeared behind me, one glowing building at a time. I kept both hands steady on the steering wheel and let the silence settle naturally inside the car. No music, no radio, just the quiet rhythm of windshield wipers cutting through snowfall. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the porch light had already switched on automatically. Thomas installed that sensor years ago because he worried about me walking up dark steps after evening church events. Little acts of care survive people sometimes. I sat in the parked car for nearly 10 minutes staring at the house. The windows glowed softly against the snow-covered yard. Everything looked peaceful, stable, safe. Yet for the first time since Thomas died, I realized safety and love were not always the same thing. Inside, the house smelled faintly like cedarwood and old books. I removed my coat carefully and hung it beside Thomas's winter jacket, which still remained untouched near the front closet. I used to think keeping his things exactly where they were meant loyalty. Lately, it simply felt like waiting. I walked into the kitchen, filled the kettle with water, and stood silently beside the counter while it heated. My reflection in the dark window looked older than 68 that night. Not weaker, just clearer somehow. I thought about Daniel's words outside the hotel. Luxury retirement community. Consolidate assets. Simplify responsibilities. The language itself revealed everything. He did not see my life as memories or history. He saw square footage, property value, financial opportunity. I carried my tea into Thomas's old study and opened the mahogany desk drawer where we kept important documents. insurance papers, property records, investment accounts, trust agreements. Everything neatly organized in labeled folders because Thomas believed chaos created vulnerability. My fingers paused on a thick cream-colored envelope marked Carter Family Trust. Years ago, after Melissa married Daniel, Thomas insisted we structure portions of our estate carefully. Love your children generously, he told me once while reviewing paperwork at this very desk. But never hand control to someone who confuses gratitude with entitlement. At the time, I thought he sounded overly cautious. Now his words echoed differently. I opened the folder slowly. Legal language covered page after page beneath the warm glow of the desk lamp. Trust distributions, property provisions, emergency access authorizations. Daniel's name appeared more times than I expected. Thomas added certain financial protections after Melissa convinced us Daniel needed support while building his career. I remembered every conversation now with painful clarity. Temporary assistance, strategic investment in family, shared future security. Such harmless phrases. I stared quietly at the documents for a long time before finally reaching for my phone. It was nearly 1 a.m, but I knew Arthur Bennett would still answer. Arthur had been our attorney for over 30 years. Reliable, careful, the kind of man who still mailed handwritten Christmas cards every December. He picked up after the second ring. Evelyn. His voice sounded immediately alert. Is everything all right? I looked down at the open trust documents spread across Thomas's desk. I need to schedule a meeting, I said calmly. As soon as possible. Arthur grew quiet for half a second. Of course. Tomorrow morning? Yes. Snow continued falling outside while I spoke. Soft, silent, steady. There are some arrangements I would like to revisit. After hanging up, I sat alone in the study with my untouched tea cooling beside stacks of paperwork. Strangely enough, I did not feel angry anymore. Anger is loud, emotional, temporary. What settled inside me instead was something colder and far more useful. Clarity. Daniel believed I would continue behaving exactly as I always had. Generous, patient, accommodating. He mistook kindness for permanent access. That was his first real mistake. Arthur Bennett's office overlooked a quiet street lined with bare maple trees and small brick storefronts decorated for winter. I arrived 15 minutes early the next morning carrying a leather folder and wearing the same navy coat from the party. The receptionist greeted me warmly because after 3 decades, Arthur's office felt less like a business and more like an extension of our family history. Framed photographs of grandchildren and holiday cards covered the shelves behind her desk. Ordinary things. Honest things. Arthur himself opened the office door with concern already written across his face. Evelyn, he said gently, shaking my hand. You sounded serious last night. I am, I answered calmly. He led me into his office where sunlight stretched across rows of legal books and polished wooden cabinets. For a moment, I remembered sitting in that same room years earlier beside Thomas while discussing retirement plans and estate protections. Back then, the future still felt stable, predictable. Arthur waited patiently while I removed documents from my folder one by one. Trust agreements, property records, power of attorney authorizations. I need everything reviewed, I said quietly, especially every financial connection involving Daniel Brooks. Arthur adjusted his glasses and began reading carefully. The room remained silent except for the soft turning of paper pages. After several minutes, he leaned back slowly in his chair. Thomas structured these accounts more generously than I remembered. He trusted family, I replied. Arthur studied me for a long moment before speaking carefully. And now you do not. I looked out the window toward the snow gathering lightly along the sidewalk below. I think there is a difference between helping someone and funding their disrespect. Arthur nodded once. No judgment. Just understanding earned through years of watching families quietly fracture around money and entitlement. What exactly would you like changed, he asked. I folded my hands neatly in my lap before answering. Remove Daniel from every contingent authorization connected to my estate. Freeze future trust access tied to marital provisions. Transfer the Lake Forest property exclusively into my personal holding trust. And revise my medical directives immediately. Arthur wrote notes steadily across a yellow legal pad. Melissa, he asked gently. That question hurt more than the others. I swallowed carefully before answering. Melissa remains my daughter. but I am no longer comfortable allowing her husband indirect access to decisions involving my finances or property. Arthur continued writing. There will likely be questions once paperwork begins processing. I know. And reactions. I know that too. The meeting lasted nearly 2 hours. By the end, signatures covered multiple pages while fresh copies of revised documents rested inside organized folders across Arthur's desk. It felt strangely unemotional. Not dramatic. Not explosive. Just precise. Quiet. Correction after years of slow imbalance. As I prepared to leave, Arthur handed me one final envelope. These are temporary protections until the revisions finalized next week. I placed the envelope carefully inside my purse. Thank you. Arthur walked me toward the door before pausing beside the reception desk. Thomas worried about this, you know, he said softly. I stopped. What do you mean? Arthur lowered his voice respectfully. A few years before he passed, he mentioned Daniel admired status a little too much. He hoped maturity would soften it. For a moment, grief moved through me so suddenly it almost stole my breath. Thomas saw the signs long before I allowed myself to. Your husband loved you very much, Arthur added quietly. He would not want you feeling guilty for protecting yourself. Outside, the afternoon air felt sharp and cold against my face. I stood beside my car for a moment watching snow drift across the parking meters and quiet storefront windows. Somewhere downtown, Daniel was probably sitting inside a glass office discussing investments and long-term planning with the same confidence he carried at the hotel ballroom. He still believed he understood the future completely. But futures change quietly sometimes. One signature at a time. 3 weeks passed before Daniel finally realized something had changed. By then, the revised legal protections were already active and several financial access permissions connected to my estate had quietly disappeared from the system. I was arranging fresh flowers in the dining room one snowy Tuesday morning when my phone rang. Daniel's name appeared across the screen. I let it ring twice before answering. Good morning, I said calmly. Silence greeted me first. Then came his voice, tight and unusually controlled. Evelyn, I spoke with Arthur Bennett this morning. I placed white roses carefully into a crystal vase while looking out across the frozen backyard. Did you? Apparently, there have been revisions to several family arrangements. Family arrangements. Interesting how respectful his vocabulary became once paperwork entered the conversation. Yes, I answered simply. Another pause. I could almost hear him recalculating his tone in real time. I wish you would have discussed something this significant with Melissa and me first. I adjusted one of the flower stems slightly higher than the others. Why? The silence afterward lasted longer this time. Because families communicate, he finally replied. I almost smiled at that. Families communicate. Yet somehow public humiliation beneath chandeliers counted as humor, while private legal boundaries suddenly required emotional transparency. Daniel, I said quietly, families also show respect, especially when no audience is watching. His voice hardened slightly then. If this is about a joke at the party, I think you are overreacting. There it was again. That instinct to minimize what wounded other people once consequences appeared. I am not reacting emotionally, I answered calmly. I am making practical decisions. You taught me the importance of planning ahead, remember? He said nothing. Somewhere in the background, I heard office noises. Elevator chimes. Distant conversation. The sharp rhythm of expensive shoes against marble floors. Melissa is upset, he said finally. That hurt. Not because he said it. Because I already knew. My daughter had called twice during the past week, but never left a voicemail. Melissa is welcome to visit me anytime, I replied softly. Alone. His breathing changed slightly after that. Small. Noticeable. I think you are creating unnecessary division. I looked around my quiet dining room. Morning sunlight stretched across polished hardwood floors while snow drifted slowly beyond the windows Thomas once loved cleaning himself every winter. Peaceful rooms. Honest rooms. No, I said gently. I think I stopped ignoring it. Daniel ended the call less than 2 minutes later. No raised voices. No dramatic threats. Just controlled frustration from a man discovering certain doors no longer opened automatically for him. Melissa came by the following Sunday afternoon. She stood on my porch wearing a cream-colored coat and nervous eyes that looked far too young suddenly. I invited her inside without hesitation. For nearly an hour we sat together in the kitchen drinking coffee while Untouched cinnamon rolls cooled between us. She cried quietly at one point. Not loudly, not theatrically, just the exhausted tears of someone finally realizing how much of herself she had spent managing another person's ambition. He keeps saying you are punishing us, she whispered. I stirred cream into my coffee slowly before answering. Melissa, protecting yourself is not punishment. She lowered her eyes after that because deep down, I think she already understood. Before leaving, she hugged me longer than she had in years. The kind of hug children give when they suddenly remember who loved them before the world taught them to measure people by usefulness. That evening, after she drove away, I sat alone beside the living room window watching snow settle softly across the quiet street. My phone buzzed once with a message from Claire. Just 3 simple words. You were right. I never responded. Some lessons do not require explanations once people finally see clearly for themselves. I leaned back in Thomas's old armchair and closed my eyes for a moment while the house settled gently around me. In the end, I did not need revenge. I only needed to stop protecting people who became comfortable hurting me.